We're very proud of Sarah and the one that's of the U of I, and so thank you. Uh, she asked me to kind of give a little bit of a different talk here this evening, kind of setting the long-term frame for thinking about corn and soybean prices. And so this is what I put together. I hope I have enough time for it. So I'm going to tell you a story to start with, okay? You have to set yourself back to the summer of 2008. That's where I'm going to start. So this chart shows the monthly farm price of corn in Illinois going all the way back to January 1947. So it's post-World War II, all the way up. The key is, see, that chart ends in August 2008. So Daryl Good and I were looking at this back then. How many of you heard Daryl speak? He's doing well too, by the way, very much retired. But my partner in crime for many, many years. Big question, standing there in the late summer of 2008, and everybody was asking the same question, which was, okay, we've got this spike up in prices. Is it 95, 96? Or is it 72, 73? That was the big question at the time, and it would have a huge impact on how you look at land prices, cash rent bidding, everything, depending on your answer to was this, or this. Well, Daryl and I stuck our necks out and wrote a report. It came out on September 2nd, 2008, called The New Era of Corn, Soybean, and Wheat Prices. And what did we argue? So this is the exact same chart. And we argued that there were clearly visible two different eras of corn prices. One from 47 to 72. I won't ask if anybody was farming back then. I was up with same for me. I remember those prices very well. And I remember selling a lot of corn for a price that started with a 1. Or I should have gotten really bad. But anyway, so this is what these are averages for those states too, okay? $1.28 was the average post-World War II. And then with the 73 run-up in prices, right, all the way through 2006, we averaged $2.43. So basically, until 2006, if somebody asked me to say, well, what price should I plan on for a price of corn in Illinois, about the same in Iowa where I grew up, a little bit lower, I'd say 250. 250. And that was a very good number to work with. Now we have to ask, though, we only had a year of data. But we convinced ourselves that we were entering a third new era starting in 2007. We were just a little over a year into it at this time. Why do we think that we're into a new era, or era number 3? Really one reason. This chart shows the blue bars are actual ethanol production through 2007. Okay, so that's the blue bars. And ramping up nicely from about 1.5 billion gallons to 2007, 6 billion gallons. But we have just recently passed the second round of the renewable fuel standards, and those targets are here in red. So think of this as the information that we were looking at in the summer of 2008. And those standards showed that the minimum amount of ethanol was going to rise very rapidly to 15 billion gallons a year. 15 billion gallons a year. So from 6 to 15, that's over 2 billion bushels of corn. So that's why, you know, that was the wind behind the sails, why we said this was another one of those step changes in the nominal price of grains. So we came up with some projections. This is what we published, stuck our necks way out there on the chopping block. And so that's were in that September 2008 publication. Our method was, I can tell you what it was. It was extremely simple how we came up with these numbers, but it made sense to us at the time. But we came up with a 460 average price for corn in the new era. In Illinois, that's the Illinois average price. With a range from $3 to $6.70. Boy, when we put this out, did we take heat? People said we were nuts, literally. You know, people thought this was kind of, without even saying 95, 96. That's their framework. You know, of course, it's very price. That should be the top of your range. And so we thought that was justified. So we put it out there. And we likewise made forecasts of the price of corn. Soybeans, we thought that was going to be an average of 1104. I don't know why we didn't just put 11 dollars. You have to be so precise. And basically, our view was because of ethanol that this was a corn-led change in the level of prices. The previous era was really a soybean-led rally. So I feel my age, I have it right when I was in high school. And got interested in the commodity markets because of that. Really changed. So those were our forecasts. Put them out there. So planning values, we're talking about the long term, 460 and 1104. Okay. So now we're just going to jump ahead. So that was almost 14 years ago. Almost 14 years ago. How did we do? Right. The actual average for that 14 years today was 437. So we're off a little under 5%. 14 years isn't bad, is it? And our ranges captured things remarkably well. What about soybeans? Even better there. The average price, everything that's gone on, trade wars, price, everything. We predicted 1104, the average has been 1082, off by less than 2%. So maybe it's just dumb luck, but I will probably never have a better pair of forecasts than that ever. So that's kind of the history to set up. That's the setup about what I want to do looking forward. Okay, because I'm going to now ask, you know, that's where we have been. But in this new era, there's certainly been two very distinct time periods. And so the average was 437 for the entire 07 to 21 period. But from 2007 through the summer of 2014, the average was 493, almost $5 a bushel. Then starting in the summer of 2014, since then, so that's been 7 years, 380. you can see there's over $1 a bushel difference in those averages. And so the challenge that I gave to myself was going forward, what number do I believe now? 493, 437, or 380? And give you a preview where I come out. I don't see any way that it's 493. We're not going back to those kind of highs. I just don't see the supply demand balance. I think 380 is a little low, even though we spent a lot of years on the bottom of that price range. So that period is the dominated because of surplus. 437 is a little high, so as you'll see around 425. That's what I see is where we're going to settle out. And we'll go through some factors. You can decide where you think things are going to settle out. Similar picture in soybeans. The average price was 1082. The high price early years, 1179. And then 987 since 2014. 987. And I definitely think 987 is too low. That's obviously influenced a lot by the period of the trade war. And I'm sure I remember this correctly, but I believe I'm going with 1075. You're going to look at my, we'll get to it, but if you look at the averages to date in this new era, price ratios, particularly the first 5 years, favored corn. It was corn-led boom. My prices, my long planting prices, are now shading just the opposite direction. That soybeans are going to be a bit favored relative to corn, and I'll explain why. So, okay, well, let me pause for a second. I'll go on to kind of the factors that I think are going to affect the outlook going forward. Any questions? All right, so I'm going to give you 2 factors that are bad news and 2 factors that are good news. Okay, as we look into the future. So we know that, or at least my argument is, the step increase in corn prices was driven by ethanol and the biofuels mandates. Well, that looks good as you know, the graph section, but it's been what I call the equivalent of political trench warfare in Washington, D.C., getting those mandates in force. And so we've never yet achieved actually in practice the 15 billion gallons consistently. But it still has put a very high floor under ethanol and the amount of corn going into ethanol, even if we haven't been able to achieve the original goal of 15 billion gallons by now. But it has been an intense political battle that has taken, some of the, basically what it's done, the political pushback from the crude oil refining industry is it's basically practically capped U.S. domestic ethanol use just a little above E10 level. And we've been stuck there really for 6 or 7 years now. And that's what this political battle over the RFS is all about. And so I see that as a negative going forward. Now, there's something coming up that is going to be really important. You may not have heard about it. It's called the Big 2023 Reset for the RFS. the specific volumetric standard, 15, 15, 15, that's literally a table in the law. But that table ends in 2022. So there are no specific volumetric standards for ethanol or other biofuels after 2022 this year. But there's a huge amount of misinformation, misunderstanding on this front that the RFS does not sunset after 2022. Okay? It's kind of weird legislation. It calls for promulgating annual mandates, but it doesn't say what specific volumes those have to be. And however they get to those volumes, they were actually supposed to have been established by late 2021, hasn't happened. And this is the directions that govern setting the RFS mandates after this year. Required volumes of renewable fuels shall be determined by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator in coordination with the Secretary of Energy and Secretary of Agriculture. And it does not mean the EPA Administrator has free rein to say whatever volumes are preferred. There are only broad criteria provided in the RFS statute. But getting through all the gobbledygook, what this means is an environment for setting the biofuels mandates out of the RFS. Probably not going to be favorable to agriculture. This is my first negative factor. Negative factor. Okay. The potential negative impacts of electrical vehicles on ethanol use. There's obviously going to be widely varying opinions on this, but I'm convinced that EVs, electrical vehicles, are that transition is still problems to solve, but I just keep kind of tabs of people I know that have them, and like I said, they have their problems, but people love these things, and I think people are going to like them, and I think it's the wave of the future, and it's where the car companies are putting all of their R&D, all of their development. Policy is going to follow that. Okay. You'll often see charts like this. This is from a Bloomberg report, and it's showing EV share of new passenger vehicle sales starting in 2015, and you see this rising curve. My gosh, it looks like half the country is going to have an electrical vehicle in a few years. You see, that's a really scary looking chart. But the same report, that's the chart. And that's oil demand for road transportation. If you look at it carefully, it shows rising crude oil demand, which for road transportation, which means rising gasoline demand. And if you look at it carefully, up to 2035. And then basically where we've been recently It's into the 2040s. We would see any real nick in terms of gasoline use. But this is, I think it actually makes sense once I dug into the numbers. So that's a long, long time from now. If you think this is the forecast, there's no danger to ethanol use in the form of gasoline blends for probably at least a minimum of a decade, maybe as long as 2 decades. So how do you reconcile that scary graph with that graph? Just a few numbers for you, okay? Are out there on EVs, and how much policy discussion do you hear about incentives for EVs? But there's actually a very simple explanation for how 35 in a good year, we sold 17 million new cars and trucks per year. In a good year. Not much more than that right now. Starting in 2022, if 100% of all new car and truck sales going forward are EVs, it would take 17 years to complete the transition. That's if no internal combustion engine vehicles were ever sold again. Which is obviously highly unrealistic. In this scenario, as unrealistic as it is, after 5 years, so just the basic arithmetic of how huge the fleet is of internal combustion engine vehicles, and we're going to use them up for that's absolutely bare minimum 20 years later. Notice that my every one of the 17 million so relative to the numbers, so this is late state item. So you see this is the penetration of EVs as a percent of new car sales. Look at this as the penetration of the 17 million. Well, notice you're not getting 50% until 2035. Now this, like I said, this is going to happen, in my opinion. And I think this is probably as good a scenario analysis as you're going to find. And we are at a early stage of that transition. And so, for us, these kinds of technological transitions really take. Right now, I'm reading a wonderful book. It's called Tractor Wars. Brand new book called John Deere Henry Ford, International Harvester and the Birth of Modern Agriculture. And it's all about the formation of John Deere, Ford tractors, and IH tractors, and how they came out of this tumultuous industry from about 1910 to 1925, 30 or so. And what's interesting is how much when I'm reading this feels like electrical vehicles. And to give you an idea how long, put this in perspective, I look this up. It's easy to forget how long these technological transitions can take. Think about this. It was not until 1985 that tractor power overtook horsepower on U.S. farms. During World War II, we were using more horses than tractors on U.S. farms. There was still widespread uses of horses for power in the United States in the late 40s and early 50s. And both of my granddads, I can tell the story. I had personal knowledge of this. They were farmers who grew up with horses. Horsemen loved their horses. My granddad, on my dad's side of the family, died. He had 25 quarter horses. I don't have horses anymore. And, you know, loved his horses. And farming was never as much fun when you had to get rid of these horses for farming. Tractors just were not the same thing. So my point in saying that is we have to keep our head understanding that EVs are coming in, but I don't see much impact for the next 10 or 15 years, simply because of the basic arithmetic surrounding penetration and the ginormous size of the internal combustion engine fleet that we currently have. So that's a negative, but I'm going to call it maybe. So let me now turn to the positive factors. Back to biofuels. How many of you heard of the California low carbon fuel standard? If you haven't, you're going to hear a lot more about it. California has a law that's that can be emitted in transportation. And target reducing it by 25% below 2010 levels by 2035. Every fuel used in transportation gets a score for its carbon intensity based on a life cycle greenhouse gas analysis. Fuels with the CI above the target generate deficits, and those below generate credits. So petroleum, gasoline, petroleum, diesel. And fuels like and biodiesel generate credits because they're lower carbon fuels, and that's you get lower carbon fuels in. You have to if you're going to meet the targets. So the outdated parties in the system comply with the CI of their fuels. They generate credits in the secondary. And how this all is a market determined price of carbon per ton. And then this feeds back into the CI scores into the dollar value of your deficit credits. And you can see that it started off about $50 $200 a ton. Recently, it's faded back towards $150 a ton. So that's like an index of the costliness of California meeting its carbon reduction targets. So what generates the credits? Okay, it's pretty easy to understand it. Gasoline is going to be a deficit. Yes. Well, what can they add to their fuel supply to offset that? Well, there's a variety of fuels that generate credits. But this is the one that's causing all the fireworks. Renewable diesel. Maybe you've heard the term renewable diesel. Okay, all right, I'll explain to you. I'm going to all right. Okay, I'm sure you're familiar with biodiesel. Everybody's familiar with biodiesel made from soy? It's really vegetable oils, mainly soybean oil. So we'll keep our terms consistent there. I'm going to call that FAME biodiesel. FAME stands for fatty acid methyl. Basically, biodiesel is, think of it as soybean oil that has been through a chemical catalytic conversion process, okay? So a chemical reaction, a chemical reaction, and you have to take out the water and the glycerin, but it's really not, it's simple enough, as bad at chemistry as I am, I can understand. Basically, you can go on the web, you can find people with dumped jugs and show how to make biodiesel. You can do it. We just do it on an industrial scale. We've been doing that for a long time. That's what we're familiar with. That's biodiesel. Biodiesel is that way. So one, usually it's blended with petroleum diesel about 2 to 5%. But in general, it certainly is not chemically identical to petroleum diesel. But, you know, it works well. It blends at those levels. But higher blends than that, it can cause some problems, particularly in cold weather. Okay, so that's FAME biodiesel. Then we're going to talk about renewable diesel. Okay, interesting. Made from the same feedstocks as FAME biodiesel. So FAME biodiesel, number one feedstock, soybean oil. What's the second? I think used oil, white grease, tallow, corn oil. And these are the main fats and oil feedstocks for FAME biodiesel. You use exactly the same feedstocks for renewable diesel. But what the production process is very different. You literally, in renewable diesel, refine it in a petroleum refinery. You put this stuff into what they call a cracker unit, and you heat it up extremely high temperatures under high pressure, add a bunch of catalysts to it, and out the other side comes cracked hydrocarbons in liquid form. And then with some more processing, turns into a fuel known as renewable diesel. The trick is this renewable diesel is 100% a drop-in fuel. It is chemically indistinguishable from petroleum diesel. Chemically indistinguishable from petroleum diesel. So you can run 100% of the stuff. You can blend in with petroleum as well, but it's a true drop-in fuel. So that's what renewable diesel is. And the way LCFS is set up, it uniquely advantages renewable diesel in its carbon intensity scoring. And this is the result. The United States is in the midst of a renewable diesel plant expansion, similar to what we did 50 years ago. And in fact, you can get literally some crazy numbers out there. So, you know, for a long, long time, we were under 500 million gallons. It was not kind of a niche fuel, much smaller than FAME biodiesel. But with these big connections to get out of the California system, look at this. Data from the USDA, calling it to compare, it's to change daily. But look at the numbers. We know that we added 1 billion gallons of renewable diesel capacity in 2021. 2.2 gallons slated for 2022. Another 1.9 billion in 2023. 1.2 billion gallons. Here's the way to think about the potential market impact of this. Peanut butter buying 3 billion. Pounds. So that's 24 billion pounds of soybean oil. That's all for all uses. So if there is a bright demand spot for grains going forward, this is it. Well, it's, first off, FAME biodiesel is very expensive itself. Typically runs between $1 and $2 per gallon. In order to cover cost of production for FAME biodiesel, it has to be $1 to $2 per gallon above wholesale diesel. And you ask, well, why is it so expensive? Because A, we don't produce that many pounds of soybean oil per acre of soybeans. And B, its main use up until now is as it's a food grade. So it's not as high as a feed grade good like corn. So that's basically why it's more expensive. Renewable diesel is even more expensive because you're adding all of that power for heat. You've got all the investment into the refining technology. And so we don't have very good data on prices of renewable diesel. It's still they do tend to be, you know, located where about the west. definition about an aviation fuel. It's the same renewable diesel. And this is already having makes the point. Traditionally, you would get about a value and 2/3 from 50/50. Just caused a huge, it's just a demand shock for renewable diesel on soybean oil prices. And I think it's going to stay. I mean, it almost has to. I'm almost done. All right. On this one. Inflation. So, the details of this broad money supply. 2010, literally, this is my generation. Treatment said, you want to cause inflation, just helicopter action drop. That's pretty much. This chart put together. Now, in general, well, in my comments are that all four have a positive factor for commodity prices in general and for grain prices. The early stages of a general price inflation. It's happened in the 70s, and for now, it's happening again post-COVID. And those are very high rates of inflation. And initially, everyone seemed to think it was transitory. Now we're trying to figure out, how long it's going to last. I think we're figuring out, we just literally printed money, and now we're dealing with the prices. Here's where things really get dicey. Long-term interest rates. So the Great Market Consumer Price Index. The same pattern. Because if you are a bondholder, you're long bonds, if you're the owner, you want an interest rate that at least covers inflation, right? You want an interest return that at least preserves your purchasing power. So we are in a giant financial standoff right now. Inflation has spiked, but the long-term bond market doesn't believe it's going to last. And, so just a couple of headlines for you that I think are interesting. Very interesting article, Wall Street Journal this week, by a prominent economist, arguing that the market is too serene about inflation. Fascinating to me, human nature, as it comes to economic matters. In the 70s, when I was growing up, the problem was when Volcker came in, no one took him seriously. So even though he cranked down on the rate of inflation with the big interest rate spikes and the long-term interest rates, investors got burned, and they feared that at some point they'd given political pressure to come back. Now, it seems to me, that's the problem. I think long-term bond investors have too much faith in the Federal Reserve and our fiscal policy that somehow this is all right and a 2% return on bonds is going to be just fine. I'm not taking any of my money. So you remember in the era of Alan Greenspan, the bond vigilantes? Anybody remember that term? You know, inflation started kicking up, then the long-term bond investors would start demanding lots higher interest rates, which would kill inflation. My question is, where are they now? So just a few closing thoughts. I know I've gone a little bit long. You can see that there. Yeah, I was. So you asked me for a long-term framework. I'm at least, I'd say, modestly bullish about the prices here in the next 3 to 5 years. And for planning purposes, I would use 425 for corn and 1075 for beans, with a slight lean towards soybeans.
Anybody have any questions for Dr. Irwin?
That was a lot. More than you probably wanted, but so what did you expect?
I was just saying, go into marketing, kind of figuring it out. I always tell our customers they had a little bit
For listening, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.